Welcome to another edition of Strange Planet. Great to have you on board. What if you could never be sure who was really human? What if the person next to you had a secret that could change everything you thought you knew about reality? We're going to talk about beings that look like us but are not. They've been among us perhaps, it seems, since the beginning of history, hiding in plain sight. Some are benevolent, some are malevolent, and some may be just curious. We'll get into shapeshifters and strangers over the course of the next 45 minutes, and maybe even get into some haunted objects as well. And let me introduce to you once again a good friend of mine and a good friend of Strange Planet, Jim Harold, who is among America's most popular paranormal podcast hosts with his free programs, the Paranormal Podcast and Jim Harold's Campfire. Jim has developed a very, very loyal following over the last, decade and a half, almost 20 years, and a fan following that spans the globe. He's also the author of 5 volumes of True Ghost Stories and the True Ghost Story Adult Coloring Book. Jim Harold, welcome back. How are you?
Good, Richard. Always good to be with you and the Strange Planet audience to talk about spooky stuff, and in this case, some strange beings and possibly some haunted objects. So good to be with you once again, and thank you for the invite.
You were telling me that the Paranormal Podcast you're coming up on, is it 600 episodes?
No, Campfire. Campfire, probably by the time this is out, we will have published our 600th episode.
Wow.
And we just celebrated our 14th anniversary on that one. And then the 18th anniversary of the Paranormal Podcast is coming up this July. So it's old enough I guess old enough to serve in the military, maybe not have a drink here in the States. But it will be 18 years old. It's just amazing to me that podcasting's even been around that long and that I've been doing it. So it's been a heck of a ride, and I'm very grateful for the medium and to have met great people like you.
Likewise. Strangers. I was on Instagram the other day, and someone had posed the question, tell me about a stranger that changed your life. And just very quickly, it was an amazing story. Someone responded, and they said that they were alone on New Year's Eve. They went to a Waffle House, and there was this couple sitting next to them. And the person was eating a steak with his bare hands, and he was so annoyed, and he was kind of chomping loudly, and he got really annoyed with that. And then they were just talking a lot and really, loudly, and he was rolling his eyes, and he was basically giving this guy, the stare down. And at the end of the evening, he went to pay his bill, and the person who was eating the steak with one hand got up, and he saw that this man had one arm, which is why he was eating a steak with his hands with one hand, because he couldn't cut his meat. And he went to pay his bill, and the waitress came over and said, no, that gentleman with the one arm paid your bill, and he wanted to apologize.
Wow.
If you were upset with him. He had the feeling that you were upset. And I just thought, wow, that's an amazing story. And so the person on Instagram said, if that person is out there watching this, I just want to, first of all, apologize for my behavior and to thank you. He also wrote on the bill, it looks like you're having a really rotten New Year's Eve. I hope next year is better.
Wow.
So,
and that's kind of a lesson in humility, that you can't understand what's going on with someone else unless you walk a mile in their shoes.
Right.
And sometimes you get angry with people. I've had that one time. I was, wondering somebody wasn't getting back to me on something. And I'm like, what is wrong with them? They should be getting back to me. And I found out that, they were ill. Mm-hmm. And it was kind of like, well, how presumptuous of you to get, I didn't do anything or send any bad messages, but I was starting to get angry with the person internally. And I found out that they had been, pretty ill. And it's like, you always have to think, maybe when that person cuts you off in traffic or somebody is unkind, maybe they're having an exceptional bad day or maybe an exceptionally bad life. It's a good lesson for all of us to learn.
Right, right. Strangers, they come into our lives sometimes and they're gone and we don't really know, what the purpose was. But sometimes they can impact us in very major ways. Sometimes they can impact us in a good way, and sometimes not such a good way. I know you have a collection of stories from Campfire relating to strangers, and one of them happens to be someone known as the bizarre trespasser. This came from, is it Abdullah?
Yeah, this was interesting. This was Abdullah from New York, and he called in about this story from Pakistan, which I really love about the Campfire. And some of the stories we'll talk about tonight are from all over the world. Canada, Pakistan, Northern Ireland, the U.S. So I love that kind of international flair we got. And this story was about his grandmother. And his grandmother was, this was in the early 1970s. Abdullah's grandmother had a large family and she was orphaned at a young age. So when she got married, she took in quite a few people from her family who needed help at different times. And at this particular time, Abdullah's grandfather was serving in the military and his grandma was at the family home with a bunch of other women, no men around. She was very, very protective of everyone, kind of a fierce warrior kind of woman. So anyway, she woke up in the middle of the night to go use the restroom, and as she was making her way from her bedroom down to the restroom, she saw through the window that there was someone who was sitting on their boundary wall and smoking. I guess the way that houses are in Asia, that they don't have that part of Asia. They don't have fences. They usually have boundary walls. So she thought was very odd. And she started to get her hackles up. And she said, I am going to, and this person was smoking a cigarette. And she's like, I am going to go give this person a piece of my mind. I'm going to go teach this guy a lesson. So she picks up her walking stick she had in the house. And she goes out and she starts yelling at this guy and cursing and swinging her stick. And as she walks up to the boundary wall, Richard, she realizes that this is not a person there. It is a disembodied hand holding a cigarette. But guess what? Obviously, the hand was more scared than she was because it just literally dissipated slowly because she stood up to it. And it was funny because a few days later, one of her very close friends, a man, was visiting and said that he had seen the same thing. One day he was driving back from work late at night. He was really tired, and he saw in the shadow of a building what looked like a guy standing there smoking. And all of a sudden, he got this great urge to smoke. And he kind of yells out, could you lend me a cigarette? And then he realizes it's this disembodied hand, but unlike the grandma, he rolls up his car window and speeds away. But I thought that's really was a neat story about really a strong woman who wasn't going to be deterred by this stranger or this strange spirit that had confronted her and her family and friends.
You're right. She was a warrior grandma. I just have one question, and that is, how did the disembodied hand light the cigarette?
I have no idea. Could you imagine, though? Could you imagine, Richard? I mean, some of the things on the show that people tell me about that they see, that they experience, I'm kind of like, how in the world could you stand up to this? It's just amazing to me, the courage of some people and what they're able to stand up to.
Absolutely. No, I would be paralyzed, I think, with fear. The disembodied hand, it reminds me of, have you ever watched that series? I think it's on Amazon Prime, Wendy, which is about Wendy from the Addams Family. She goes away.
Yeah, Wednesday.
Wednesday. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I've heard of it. I've not watched it yet. I've not watched it. But you're thinking of Cousin It, or
That's it, Cousin It.
Thing,
Yes,
or Cousin It, or Thing. Thing is the hand. Cousin It is the woolly one.
you're right. Yes, it's
Yeah,
yes.
the disembodied hand that goes through.
That's-
Which I think actually in the original series, the hand was actually that of Ted Cassidy, who played Lurch. I believe that is the case.
Oh wow, he was doing double duty.
2 roles, yeah.
There you go. Sticking with our strangers theme, tell me about Sue and the Phantom Mechanic.
Oh, I love this one. This is a great one. So this goes back to the 1980s, before cell phones and all that good stuff. And Sue was a recent college graduate, and she was up in the New England area of the States, and she decided to take an evening class, which was about an hour away from her home. And one cold and snowy November night, while driving back from class, her car started acting up. And she was forced to pull over on the interstate, and the car wouldn't go. And she said, well, this is a fine fix that I'm in. You know, we take cell phones and all that good stuff for granted now, but back in that time, if you remember, you didn't have many options. If you didn't have a CB radio, you would pretty much either have to stay and wait there for somebody to come help you, or you would flag somebody down, or you would start walking. That's right. So Sue basically said, you know, I'm not going to sit here. I'm a sitting duck. I'm going to walk and find some help. So she was dressed like in typical college clothes. She wasn't really dressed for the elements, but she says, I'm going to do this. So the thing was, there was the interstate, the highway, but down below there was a parallel old 2-lane road over the hill. So she's like in these kind of just regular shoes, not anything for the snow or anything, trudging through the snow. And she finds her way down to that 2-lane road. And luckily she finds a service station, a gas station with a garage, and the lights are on. She's like, oh, I'm saved. This is great. So anyway, she walks in, and the gas station attendant, she tells him the situation, and it's something like 5 till 8 or something. And the gas station attendant points at the clock and says, well, we're closed in 5 minutes. But he said, well, the owner lives next door. Maybe he can help. Now, she didn't recall this attendant calling the owner or anything. It's just like it kind of showed up. And he had on, you know, one of the mechanic shirts with his name. She didn't remember what his name was. And it was an older man. And he said, you know, I'm glad to help you. And she said she's typically a suspicious person, but she had faith in this man. He had a very calm and reassuring nature about him. So anyway, they go up and look at the car, and he says, well, I know what's wrong, but there's no way I can fix it now. I'll get my tow truck and we can tow it. Do you have a garage that you go to? And she said, yeah, but it's 40 miles away. So the guy tows the car 40 miles away. I don't know how many kilometers that is, but it's quite a ways. And
so it's 70.
Yeah. So it's a good distance. And then he gave her advice what to write on the paper for the mechanics, and he offered to drive her another 20 minutes back to her home, which is unique. I mean, it's, just people don't do that, right?
They don't put themselves out that way.
Exactly. And when she got to the house, she didn't really have any money on her. She said, well, I gotta pay you something for this. He said, she said, I do have a checkbook. And he said, well, $20 will be fine, which was even at that time, very, very modest for going out of his way and doing everything. And he said, you tell your family that absolutely everything's okay and everything's going to be fine. So, in a day or two, her mom and sister and her were going to go shopping. And she said, let's take a little detour. I want to drive you by that gas station where that nice old man helped me out. He was such a great guy. So this was like 48 hours afterwards. They drive past the gas station, and Sue's like, we must have the wrong place. The place looked like it had been boarded up for 15, 20 years. Like it was never, hasn't been seen the light of day. She was confused. She was unsettled. She couldn't explain this bizarre experience, but she did confirm, yes, indeed, this was the place I was at. Now, whether that was a guardian angel, whether that was a time slip, whether it was an alternate reality, Sue even said maybe it was somehow the spirit of her late father who had died when she was very young. I don't know. But I guess if I'm going to meet a stranger, that's the kind, Richard, I would like to meet.
Yes, someone handy with tools.
and handy of spirit, I would say,
yes, too. Indeed. Yes, sounds very much like a guardian angel. Hey, Jim, we're going to just take a quick time out back with more of the host of Jim Harold's Campfire and the Paranormal podcast. Stay with us.
November reminds us to be thankful and focused on boosting our radiant health before winter. And I use a potent remedy that's improved the quality of my life and deepened my sleep as well. I take C60 Evo olive oil every morning, and I have a lot more energy and mental focus all day long. My workouts are easier, and I have a lot more endurance. If you're into competitive sports, this is a game changer. Health is our greatest wealth, and Pura C60 ESS60 really works. ESS60 is a breakthrough technology delivering the carbon-60 miracle molecule for humans and pets. Check out the C60 Evo holiday gift collections for everyone on your list. They make amazing skin, lip, and hair repair serum that deliver noticeable results quickly. C60 Evo's lab has an impressive track record of 31 years and, of course, my personal recommendation. You deserve the best remedies on earth, and so do those you love. Buy direct from the lab and upgrade your life today. Use my code EVRS to save 10% off your first order. Again, my code EVRS and save 10% off your first order.
Jim Harold is with us, among America's most popular paranormal podcast hosts, the Paranormal Podcast and Jim Harold's Campfire, jimharold.com and jimharoldbooks.com. He's got 5 volumes of true ghost stories available, jimharoldbooks.com. And we're talking strangers, and I had an interesting conversation. I don't know if you've talked to Tim Schwartz about his new book called Mimics: The Others Among Us.
Not about that book, but I believe I have spoken with him in the past, I believe.
Yeah, well, this is kind of the same area that he delves into, and that is, they could be aliens, they could be Rosemary Ellen Guiley used to write about the jinn.
Yes.
Again, these are entities or beings that, whether they're able to shapeshift and look like us, or whether, they do maybe resemble us in many ways, but are not quite human, but they seem to have been amongst us, again, since the beginning of time. So we're talking strangers and other entities. Let's talk about Mysterious Molly. This came to you from, you talked about the international flavor. It comes all the way from Northern Ireland.
Yeah, this is a great story because this was at the time when Northern Ireland was having all of its troubles, the troubles.
Mm-hmm.
I think this dates back to 1980. And this is Stephen. He's from Belfast. And when in 1980, he was 14 years old. And he and his friend were Protestant kids. And a local band was playing in the Pine Club in Belfast city center. It was a good distance from where he lived. And he went along and had a great evening. Everybody was enjoying themselves. And this was kind of a neat thing because I guess this was like, I don't know, you hear about when there was the ceasing of hostilities between the Germans and the Allies. I think it was World War I over Christmas Eve. Similar kind of feel here. Catholics and Protestants would get along during that music scene, but it had its limits, but they were able to coexist a bit. He said that they mixed with Protestant Catholic kids, middle-class kids, working-class kids, gay kids, a whole range. So they were able to get along with people with differences in this small context in Northern Ireland. But they knew that they had to be home by midnight. Their parents had made it clear. So that means they had to get the last bus leaving the city center, which was about 11 o'clock. Well, guess what? They missed the bus. So that means that they were stuck. So to go home, they would have to go through an area controlled by Catholics, and very dangerous for him as a young Protestant. And so anyway, him and his friend decided this one path where they would only have to go through one Catholic area. And they had to go across this particular bridge. This one area is called the Short Strand, and this is called I believe the Albert Bridge. So anyway, they said, we'll be okay. We'll just go through, keep our heads down, go through. So anyway, they're walking on this bridge and they see this group coming at them, and they're shouting, and they're older men, grown men, shouting slurs at them for Protestants, all these different things. And these two 14-year-old kids are thinking, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? All of a sudden, there's a little old lady who just seemed to appeared on the opposite side of the road. And he was kind of shocked. He said he couldn't believe it. She walked straight across the road and she said, don't worry, boys. I'm going to take you up the road. You'll be okay. Just keep walking in front of me. Don't say anything. Just keep quiet and keep walking. So anyway, they got down to the end of the bridge. They could see these grown men, and they didn't say a word. And this old lady was just screaming at them, "They're children. What's the matter with you? Don't you have children of your own? What's wrong with you?" And they just stood there and let them pass. They got a little ways down the road. It was a safe area. They turned around to thank the woman. She was gone. But the story continues. First of all, he totally feels they both survived that because of this lady. Had not, they would have been either badly hurt or killed, possibly. So anyway, fast forward to 2020. And his father passed away. Stephen's father passed away. And a family friend came named Billy. And he came to pay his respects. Stephen had never met him. And they chatted and so forth. And it turned out, because of COVID, this was right around the time of COVID and restrictions, the funeral was a few weeks off. Billy showed up. So at their graveyard, and they finished the service and everything. And Billy says to Stephen, I want to show you something. Because Stephen had relayed this story to Billy. So this elderly man takes him to a plot, and the woman's name is Molly. And she had died before this happened, before 1980. And she was known as Molly of the Night. And there have been several occasions where people had met her, had seen her on that bridge, and she would help people. Many times people trying to commit suicide and so forth. It turns out that her son had been murdered on the back road in 1971, and she died of a broken heart. So perhaps she came back to help people like her son, people in danger, people thinking about suicide, those kind of things. So he met Molly of the Night. They both met Molly of the Night, and he saved them both. And I just think that's such a cool story.
It's a very cool story. Very uplifting.
Yes,
Very
yes.
uplifting.
And that's something that I say. I mean, there are some spooky stories. I know we're going to get to some of them. But to me, the paranormal or the supernatural is a continuum. And there's some stuff, and I, like you, I think, I believe that there is evil. I believe that there are darker energies. I think there are entities out there that mean us harm. But I also think there's good ones and helpful ones. And we've had a chance to talk about a couple of those so far.
I talked to a priest once. I was doing a TV show on exorcisms, and I traveled down to Yonkers, and I got lost in Yonkers. For those familiar with the Neil Simon play, Lost in Yonkers, I actually got lost in Yonkers. And I interviewed this board-certified psychiatrist, Dr. Richard Gallagher, and he talked about what he called a what did he use the term, like a legitimate case of demonic possession. Mm-hmm. And he put me in touch with a priest who would only go by the name Father X. I could only speak to him by phone. I couldn't meet him in person. And so I recorded our conversation for the TV episode. And he warned me. He said, whenever you talk about these things, you really open yourselves up to it. So he always would begin the session with a protective prayer. So over the phone, he prayed over me, basically, so that we could then talk about these things. Do you ever think about that, like when you're talking about malevolent entities and so forth on your show?
Sure, I do.
That you might be inviting them into your house, into your home, into your life?
Yeah, I do worry about that. In fact, you had mentioned Rosemary Ellen Guiley, and I'll tell you an instance where I was kind of freaked out, and it's almost exactly 10 years ago. First of all, I thought the world of Rosemary. She was literally on my show 20 times. I counted it up. And every time she would have a new book, she'd send them to me. And I have all those books except for one. And I'll explain what this, I may have told you the story before, but I don't know. So anyway, I had interviewed Rosemary 10 years ago on this particular book about the jinn. And it was early April 2013. And I remember it was a very beautiful day that day. I remember going out and having a business lunch with somebody, and I think coming back and interviewing Rosemary about her book, which she had sent to me about the jinn. And later that night, out of the blue, I get a call that my uncle died. Now, my uncle was ill. He was in the hospital. Excuse me. We knew he had some issues, some health issues, some serious health issues, but there was nothing, at least in my mind, maybe some things were being kept from me, but there was nothing in my mind that would make me make that jump that he would die. So I thought, well, I was very saddened by that. And I thought, that's an odd coincidence about that. 2 weeks later, almost to the day, I had gone out of state, gone to his funeral, come back home. He was very close with my mom and dad. They actually lived on basically the same property. My uncle had a trailer. My parents had a house. So, I mean, it wasn't like, you have an uncle who's like a distant uncle. I mean, right. We were all very close. I grew up with my uncle. He was like a second dad. So anyway, that was a pretty devastating loss. And then 2 weeks later, it's about, 1 o'clock in the morning, I get a call from a neighbor of my parents. And I'm like, oh, something's wrong with my dad, because he probably, emotionally couldn't take this. And something's happened. Turned out it was my mom. And she died totally unexpectedly.
Oh.
And I just, at that point, Richard, I said, I think I'm going to get rid of that book. And I never in any way felt ill towards Rosemary about that in any way whatsoever. I may have even told her about this, but I just did not feel comfortable with that book in my house after those very strange incidents. So to answer your question, yes, I do think of that.
Do you take precautions? What do you do?
I try to think positively. I don't do a lot of prayers. I probably should do more than I should, or than I do. But I always try to treat all this respectfully and not make it a joke, because I don't think it is a joke. I think it's, it's a real thing. And, I like to think I believe in God, and I believe that my family's been watched over, and I appreciate that very much. And so far, so good. And again, I'm not 100% that was directly linked, but it was just a little too close for comfort. And I thought, well, maybe those are not the books to keep around the house, that particular one.
Well, thank you for sharing that with me, Jim. All right, we'll take another time out back, and we'll discuss haunted objects. Stay with us.
Every new season, we find a reason to improve our lives and our health. And C60 Evo organic edible oils deliver noticeable benefits quickly. A spoonful in the morning delivers energy and endurance all day long. And I sleep deeper and wake up feeling refreshed because C60 ESS60 works. Carbon 60 received the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1996 when it was used for industrial applications. C60 Evo's ESS60 is a breakthrough technology upgrading C60 to be safe for human and pet consumption. ESS60 has been called a miracle molecule because of the physical and mental benefits people are enjoying. Their lab has a proven track record of 31 years and thousands of happy customers across the world, just like me. So treat yourself, your friends, and your family to C60 Evo and use my link, EVRS, to get 10% off your first order. Again, my link, EVRS, to get 10% off your first order.
Jim Harold is with us, host of the Paranormal podcast and Jim Harold's Campfire, jimharold.com and jimharoldbooks.com. He's got 5 volumes of true ghost stories and also the True Ghost Story adult coloring book to boot, all available through jimharoldbooks.com. We've been talking about strangers, but I want to shift gears here and talk now about haunted objects. I know this is that's something that comes up from time to time, both on Campfire and the Paranormal podcast. Tell me about the lamp lady who comes out at night.
Yeah, this is one that kind of goes back to the very early days of Campfire, but it's one that I can never forget. This was from Amy from Montana, and she was about 14 years old when this happened, and her aunt had been going through some things in her house, and she asked Amy if she wanted this lamp. It was a ceramic figure of a woman a standing Spanish flamenco dancer. Her hand was in an upward position with a tambourine in it. The woman had a full skirt that was swirling as if she were dancing, and it had all these different colored light bulbs in the skirt. You could plug it in, it would light up. It was very unique, she said. So she took it home, and no more than a week after she put it in her room, the first strange thing happened. She lived out in the country, and when the bus would come in the morning for school, it was still dark. Her mom would wake her up before everyone else, and she'd turn up the heat because it's very cold. And you know, Richard, when you live with somebody for a long time and you hear them walking, you can recognize their steps. Mm-hmm. So anyway, she was in a room, and she heard the shuffle of her mom's slippers because the thermostat was right outside Amy's door. And she called out to her mom. She didn't respond. And she heard the footsteps coming closer and closer to her door. And Amy looks up, and to her surprise, it was the woman from the lamp standing in her doorway.
Oh, dear Lord.
She said that she was in the same position as the lamp, same position of the hand held up. A chill went through Amy. And she felt that this thing had tried to trick her into thinking it was her mother because she was basically mimicking, as you were talking about, these shuffling slippers. And it was a human figure. It was solid. And then it continued to appear every single night for several weeks. And each night it got closer and closer to her bed. She said she remembered the overwhelming feeling of evil and that it meant her harm. After it happened, she said it never occurred to her to tell anyone. It's almost like it had blocked itself off in her memory. Yet every night as she fell asleep, she would have that dread knowing it was going to come to her in the night. Now, she had a 4-poster bed, and towards the end of this, the thing got so close that it put both of its hands on the bottom posts of her bed and was leaning over it. She said it still freaks her out to this day. So she told her parents, and they said, "Oh, we'll get rid of it." Okay, so they did, and nothing happened for a while. She even moved her bed differently so she wouldn't have to look at her doorway anymore. But a few weeks after, she was laying in bed, and as she looked over, a hand came around the doorway and grabbed the post right next to her head.
Oh, dear Lord.
It was the same hand from the same woman. After that, she said, "What else can I do? The lamp is gone. I've told my parents." She talked to her pastor. Her pastor said, "Rebuke it." But when this thing would come, she couldn't speak. So anyway, A couple of days later, she's outside with her sister. They're playing behind an outbuilding. And guess what's lying there? The lamp. The lamp is still there. So she talks to her parents again, and finally her dad really throws it out. And after that, nothing else. Now, she finds out, and I don't know how she found this out, but she said she found out after the fact. We found out that there was actually a woman who had made the lamp. It was a ceramic cast piece, and this woman had gotten in a lot of trouble legally for abusing children.
Oh, dear.
So she doesn't know if somebody put something into that lamp, like a spiritual thing, but she felt very targeted, as though this thing wanted to scare her, terrify her, and make her life a living hell.
You know, it just reinforces something, again, that Rosemary Ellen Guiley used to say, and that is you have to be very careful what you bring home, from the flea market. And you and I both like old things,
yes,
like vintage things, and we're
yes.
tempted. You got to be careful. You don't know what might have attached itself.
You know, honestly, I used to do more thrifting than I used to do. I used to bring home a lot of old stuff. And even in my video background, there's old stuff in there. But the thing is that honestly, for two reasons, I've slowed that down. One being my wife will kill me because she's like, what are you doing with that old junk? And then the other one is, I do wonder about that. I mean, and I do think, I don't think this is just an intellectual exercise. I'll give you an example. I have an old pocket knife that belonged to my grandfather, who's been dead for over 40 years. But when I hold that, I don't know. I feel him somehow. Now, it may be psychological. It might just be, my mind playing tricks on me. But somehow I do think, particularly with things that we're very close with or we have a repeated exposure to, I do feel somehow our essence rubs off on those things. And it can be very positive, or as in this case, it could be not positive at all.
I can't believe she kept the lamp for that long.
Yeah.
Yeah, and sometimes you throw things away and they come back. I know we're going to talk about a Ouija board next, but I remember we were doing a remote broadcast when I was working with another radio station at the big fairgrounds in Toronto called the Canadian National Exhibition, the CNE. And we weren't I was producing, I wasn't hosting. We weren't talking about Ouija boards, but there was a couple of young ladies there, and they were, I would describe them as kind of goth. They had the black nail polish and, the getup that they wear. And without me prompting them or asking them, and I wasn't talking about this kind of stuff, they started talking about their experience with a Ouija board, and it was totally unsolicited. And this was, back in the early to mid 90s. I wasn't even involved in this arena, and they talked about how they had a bad experience with the Ouija board, and they tried to throw it out, and it kept coming back, and they took it to a dumpster, and it came back, and then finally, I think they burned it or something, and then buried the ashes in the backyard. So again, Ouija boards, not to be trifled with. You have a Ouija board story from Rachel.
Yeah, this is one where actually a Ouija board brought through something very interesting. And I've always looked at Ouija boards like a spiritual chainsaw. I've talked to people. I think you've talked to Karen Dahlman, for example, in the past, and Robert Murch and different people who are kind of aficionados of the Ouija board. And they always assure me it's just a tool and those kind of things. But what I say to that is that perhaps it is in your hands. Perhaps I wouldn't say that it's not. But I look at it, Richard, and I think we've talked about this before, like a chainsaw. Okay, you see these people who could take a chainsaw and make a beautiful sculpture out of wood or out of ice even. Mm-hmm. Just great things they can do with it. Now, Richard, what do you think happens if you hand me a chainsaw? Chances are I cut off my arm. So if you hand somebody a Ouija board who doesn't know what they're doing, do I think that it's more than a toy? I kind of do. I've heard too many stories of similar stories to what you said, where people had tried to burn it. I had one story where somebody said the Ouija board was going crazy and the planchette was doing a figure eight, and so much so that it made a figure eight pattern on the board by itself. Another one where someone said that a board was down the floor and started walking inchworm style.
Oh.
Yeah, that's it's like, okay, I'm out. I'm like Don Knotts in The Ghost in Mr. Chicken. I'm like, keep me behind the mic, safely behind the mic. I don't want to experience this. But this is kind of an interesting Ouija board story we have here. This is about Rachel, and I believe she was from Michigan. This was in the late 80s, and she had gotten a Ouija board. And her and her cousins were together. She brought it over to her cousin's house when they went to visit. And they lived next door to a gentleman who had passed. His name was Bill. And Rachel didn't know him, but the cousin sure did. And he was a close family friend, and he had just passed. So they're in Rachel's cousin's bedroom. There were 4 of them. And they got the Ouija board out and started asking some questions and moving along. And they didn't know if it was somebody moving it or if it's doing it itself. You know, you always have that question. So they're holding on to the planchette, and the cousins asked a question, can we see Bill? Bill had died a few weeks earlier, and they wanted to communicate with him somehow. And the board said yes. So they were just waiting around wondering, how's that possible? How are we going to communicate with Bill with this Ouija board? And she said, as they were watching, the planchette moves across the board and it spells out Mirror. And they looked at each other like, where's the mirror? And then it's like, oh yeah, my cousin has a dresser with a big mirror on top of it right behind him. So they said, well, we guess we'll have to look in the mirror. Maybe some writing will appear or something. They had no idea. Nobody saw anything except for Rachel. Then Rachel said her vision started. She said it was kind of like when you look at the sun or something bright and you get kind of hazy vision. And as she was looking at it, she saw the outline and form of a man in the mirror. She said, I could still see him. I described this man, what he looked like, the hair on his head, the glasses he had on, the body type, even down to his flannel shirt. That's all she could really tell. She didn't recognize him at all. Once it got past his waist, she couldn't see a thing. But it was a man, and he was just standing there. He said it never got into a clear mirror image, but it kind of looked like a photo negative. So she was describing what she was seeing. And their cousins all of a sudden were like, you know what? We don't want to do that anymore. This is dumb. And she felt badly. She's like, did I offend them? Are they upset? Maybe, because they think I'm making this up. And a little while later, one of her cousins who had gone to the restroom comes out crying. And Rachel asked her if something's wrong. And she got really upset and told me it wasn't fair that I got to see Bill and she didn't. Because Rachel had described him exactly how he looked, down to the type of glasses he had and everything. And she had never, ever met him before. So, wow. And Rachel said, I'm glad I wasn't making something up to upset you, but I just saw a dead man in the mirror. And, that sounds like a teenage story that somebody would make up, but I think it might be possible. I really do. I think it might very well be possible.
Yeah, I do too. Now, what exactly are we seeing? It gets into the whole discussion around ghosts and whether they are, what's the term, familiars, whether we're being deceived.
Right.
That these are not the spirits of our dearly departed loved ones, but something else. Well,
Imposters. I mean, I always wonder if you're trying to reach Aunt Mildred and Aunt Mildred starts talking back. Is it really Aunt Mildred, or is it like some kind of demon or something?
Exactly.
And you really have no way of knowing.
You do not. So that leads us to sort of back to our discussion earlier about the others and strangers. And there's perhaps nothing creepier, I think, than black-eyed kids or black-eyed children. This was another topic that was near and dear to Rosemary Ellen Guiley. She did a lot of research in this area as well. Black-eyed children. Tell me about this story from Tony in Tennessee.
Yeah, this is another classic one from the books. Tony from Tennessee, he lived in kind of a college area, and he had this chilling encounter. And basically, one night, he had a very uneasy feeling of impending doom and decided to go to bed without eating on this particular night. And he said that was very unusual for him. And around 1 o'clock in the morning, he started to hear knocking at his door. And he initially dismissed it, as just a bunch of college kids messing around, that kind of thing, as college kids do. And then it just kept going on every few minutes. And then he said, this is enough. It's about 2:20 in the morning, 2:22, I think he said specifically. And he said, I'm going to go tell these kids off. So he opens the door and there's a girl there. And she's looking down, not looking at him. He said that was probably 14 years old. She was looking at the ground. And the first thing she said to him was, "They sent me here." Now, he's freaked out as it is. He was feeling uneasy the whole night, and this girl shows up telling him, "They sent me here." So he naturally says, "Who sent you here?" And she said, "Just please let me in." And Tony said he felt this cold, cold air just sweep over him. He said the most chilling air ever. And his stomach turned. He said he never felt that way before. So he hasn't made eye contact with her. She's talking in an emotionless, dronish type voice, he says. And she says, "Please let me in." He said, "Look, I'll go grab a phone. You can use the telephone. You want to call somebody?" She says, "No, please let me in. They sent me here." And he yells, he's exasperated, "Who sent you here?" He said, "Finally, I'm getting the phone. I'm calling the police." So he turns around, he turns the lights on, and he says, "I am not letting you in." And as soon as he said that, she started getting very, very agitated. She kept saying, "They sent me here." She looks at me and she says, "This is only going to take a minute." And Tony said, "Jim, I'm telling you, I've never been so scared." As soon as she looked up and my eyes met her entire eyes were blacked out. Not dilated pupils, but the whole eyeball was black. It just shot him back. He said, "I'm calling the police." So he turns around, grabs the phone, and that's when he turns around with the phone. Nobody's there. He calls the police and they laugh at him saying, "There's a little girl. You're a grown man and you're worried about that." And it's just one of those things. I mean, I think something about the black-eyed kids is like this juxtaposition of, innocence and children.
Right.
Something that's potentially evil. And the first person who I think popularized this on the internet, this idea, was Brian Bethel, the journalist. And I interviewed Brian about it. And he told a story that's dated back to the 90s, early 90s, I believe. And I believed him 100%. And if anything, that story's probably caused him more grief than anything. Now, what these are, your guess is as good as mine. But I do think it happens. And what's interesting, it kind of ties into that mimicry you talked about and the jinn. Because from what I understand, black-eyed kids, they will say things that don't quite make sense. They'll say something like, they'll knock on your door and say, "Can I have some mayonnaise for my hot dog?" Stuff that seems like they're trying to fit in, but it doesn't quite make sense.
Right, exactly. It's almost like and Nick Redfern writes about this, these men in black encounters, not the regular sort of government men who come to question you about UFOs. There seems to be another type where they're wearing big floppy hats, almost like they're trying to mimic or pass as a government G-man, if you will. And they have oversized sunglasses. They're hairless. There's something not quite right about them. Their clothes are ill-fitting. They're trying to impersonate or mimic. Why don't we part on a Canadian content note here? Because I know, sticking with mimics and shapeshifters, you've got a shapeshifting jinn story that comes from Ontario.
Yeah, this is very cool. Now, what was kind of cool, this happened 2 weeks in a row because it was essentially Abdullah came on with his call, and then next week, Noori, not to be confused with George Noori, but Noori from Ontario, Canada, called in, and she had a story from Pakistan, another story from Pakistan, which I think that we've had 2 total stories from Pakistan in the history of the show, and they were back-to-back weeks. But this was about a potentially shape-shifting jinn. It was 1954. It's their father's story. He would have been about 10 years old at the time. And it was Ramadan. And basically, her father's family was up, and there was no milk in the home. And his mother had told him as a little boy to go to a nearby shop to fetch some milk. Now, this would have been around 3:30 a.m. Now, that seems like an odd time to go to the market, but during Ramadan, businesses are typically open from sunset to sunrise to accommodate the fast. So basically, he was given this little steel canister like a milk can from his mom to go gather milk and ease off. There was no disposable plastics or anything in 1954 that they would be using. So anyway, he went and got the milk, and he was on his home, and he decided to take a shortcut through a nearby alley. This would have been about 4 a.m. This little boy is walking through this alley, and he noticed a man walk in from the opposite side. This man seemed exceptionally tall to the little boy. Noori's dad thought that this man looked this way because of a shadow being cast by a lamppost. But as the man started walking taller, it indeed looked like he was 7 foot tall and had a large blanket wrapped around him. So they're walking towards each other, and he moved closer, and he was closer and closer. Something seemed off about his height, of course, and his appearance. Noori's dad couldn't figure it out, but it didn't seem right. So anyway, very narrow alley, barely wide enough for 2 people to walk past. The boys wondering how they're going to squeeze past each other. Anyway, as this tall man is walking toward him, Noori's dad said what he saw can best be described as a man transforming into some sort of canine or dog. He said it was very quick, but essentially a dog had taken a place of the man. So basically, her dad was terrified, shock, fear. He didn't know what was going on, where the man had gone, and where this dog came from. The dog was black in appearance, kind of like a Doberman, and walking towards him. So he was too afraid to turn around, so he just calmly tried to walk past the dog. And the dog didn't run or bark. They simply brushed past one another. And he said, as he felt this dog go past him, his entire body was experiencing goosebumps up and down. He felt a great shiver, and he actually touched the dog. And the canister that he had with milk, he was covering with his hand because it had no lid. And he thinks at some point he removed his hand from the top of it, and the dog was passing by, brushed by him, and it felt like something had fallen into the milk. He didn't see it happen, but he said he heard something fall into the milk like a piece of clay or a little rock. After that happens, Noori's dad runs home. He doesn't dare look back. He's too afraid to. After arriving home, Noori's dad runs quickly to his mother. She's in the kitchen. He told her what happened. He handed her the can of milk and told her not to drink it because something had fallen into it. She looked at the milk, started to stir it, and she noticed it suddenly wasn't milk at all. It had turned into some sort of gluey paste, and it was very viscous in its texture. So she throws out the milk. That night, her dad actually suffered a very high fever, and he remembers it quite well, even though he was very young. He and his family firmly believe that he had a direct encounter with a jinn. And you know what? I think he very well might have.
Wow. Oh, yeah. Rosemary Ellen Guiley talked a lot about the jinn. She wrote books about the jinn, and she thought that the jinn may be kind of a common denominator behind a lot of paranormal activity, paranormal phenomenon, including alien abductions. She thinks it may be the jinn at the root of all of it. Jim, always a delight. Thank you for sending me off to bed scared, witless once again.
My
Jim
pleasure.
Harold.
That's my job.
JimHaroldBooks.com, and of course the podcast, Paranormal Podcast, and Jim Harold's Campfire, wherever fine podcasts are available, and you can learn more at JimHarold.com. Jim, thank you so much. Be well. We'll talk again soon, I hope.
Thank you, sir, and always great to spend some time with you and the great Strange Planet audience. Stay spooky.
A new Richard Syrett's Strange Planet drops every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Subscribe at StrangePlanetPodcast.com.